When we talk about the moment a woman stops needing a man, we are really talking about a psychological shift that happens deep beneath the surface of everyday life. It's not loud, it's not dramatic most of the time. It doesn't always come with a single defining breakup or a clear turning point. More often it builds slowly through repeated experiences that reshape how she understands safety, stability, and her own identity in the world. At first, there is usually a pattern of reliance that feels completely normal. Emotional reliance, where validation from a partner becomes a kind of internal compass. Financial reliance, where security is tied to someone else's ability to provide. Even social reliance, where identity is shaped through being someone's partner, rather than standing independently. None of this is unusual. In fact, it is often socially reinforced. But what changes everything is when she begins to notice a subtle discomfort inside that structure, a feeling that something essential is not fully hers. This is where the shift begins. Not in rebellion, but in awareness. She starts to recognize that depending on someone else for emotional stability means handing over control of her inner world. If their mood changes, her peace shifts. If their attention fades, her self-worth feels questioned. And over time, that creates a quiet but constant internal instability. The nervous system starts to adapt to unpredictability, and what once felt like love begins to feel like emotional fluctuation. So the first real step towards self-reliance is not independence in action, but independence in perception. She begins to ask herself, sometimes unconsciously at first, what part of my stability is actually mine? What part collapses when someone else withdraws? These questions are powerful because they redirect attention inward. Instead of looking outward for grounding, she starts experimenting with internal grounding. She begins to sit with discomfort, instead of immediately reaching for reassurance. She delays the need for external validation and observes what happens when she does. And what she discovers is often surprising. The discomfort does not destroy her. The loneliness does not break her. The uncertainty does not erase her identity. It passes. And in that passing, something important is learned at a biological and psychological level. Emotional states are not permanent, and they do not require external rescue every time they arise. This is where resilience begins to form, not as an idea, but as a lived experience in the nervous system. As this process continues, her decision-making starts to change. In earlier stages, choices may have been heavily influenced by attachment needs, staying longer than necessary, tolerating behavior that conflicts with her values, or prioritizing connection over self-respect. But as self-reliance strengthens, those decisions become more internally anchored. She begins to evaluate situations not based on fear of loss, but based on alignment with her own standards. And that is a profound neurological shift because the brain is moving from a threat response model into a value-based model. What's important here is that this is not about rejecting connection. It is about removing dependency from connection. She is no longer entering relationships to complete herself or stabilize herself. She begins to understand that stability must exist first internally. Otherwise, every relationship becomes a negotiation with insecurity. And when stability is internal, the entire emotional landscape of relationships changes. There is less anxiety, less clinging, and far more clarity. Over time, she starts to experience something that can feel both liberating and unfamiliar. Silence without panic, space without urgency, solitude without collapse. These are not small things. From a psychological standpoint, they indicate that the brain is no longer treating absence of external validation as a threat. The internal system has begun to regulate itself more effectively. And yet this is also where complexity enters. Because self-reliance does not eliminate emotional need, it refines it. She may still desire love, connection, intimacy, but now those desires are no longer driving her decisions in a compulsive way. They become choices rather than dependencies. And choice is fundamentally different from need. Need can distort perception. Choice sharpens it. So what emerges is a new version of her relationship with herself. One where she is no longer negotiating her worth through someone else's presence. One where her identity is not expanding and collapsing based on external attention. And this internal restructuring becomes the foundation for everything that follows. Because once a woman realizes she can stabilize her own emotional world, she can never fully return to the version of herself who believed she couldn't. And that realization quietly changes every future relationship she will ever have. And from here, everything begins to shift. Once emotional independence begins to take root, something very fundamental changes in how relationships are experienced at a biological and psychological level. The same external situations may still exist: dating, partnership, communication, but the internal interpretation of those situations is no longer governed by fear in the same way. What used to feel like urgency starts to feel like observation. What used to feel like attachment starts to feel like choice. And this shift quietly reorganizes the entire structure of relational dynamics. When a woman is emotionally dependent, relationships often become regulated by avoidance of loss. The nervous system is constantly tracking signals: tone of voice, response time, emotional availability, subtle changes in attention. This creates a background state of vigilance. In that state, even small inconsistencies can feel amplified because they are being processed through a lens of potential abandonment. So behavior inside the relationship often becomes reactive, over-explaining, over-giving, over-adjusting, simply to maintain connection stability. But when emotional independence starts to develop, that baseline changes. The internal system is no longer primarily organized around preventing loss. Instead, it begins to prioritize coherence. Does this situation align with my values, my emotional well-being, my long-term direction? That question alone transforms behavior, because now, instead of reacting to preserve a bond at any cost, she begins to evaluate whether the bond itself is worth preserving in its current form. This is where boundaries emerge, not as a defensive posture, but as a form of internal clarity. A boundary is essentially a neurological decision that says, this is where my emotional responsibility ends and someone else's begins. In earlier stages of attachment, those boundaries are often blurred. Emotional responsibility is shared unevenly and often disproportionately carried by the person who fears loss more intensely. But as independence strengthens, that imbalance becomes more visible and more difficult to maintain. So she begins to notice something important. She's no longer willing to regulate someone else's inconsistency at the cost of her own stability. She's no longer willing to stay in cycles of emotional unpredictability just to maintain proximity. And this is not because she's become detached or indifferent, but because her internal baseline has changed. Stability has become more valuable than familiarity. And this is where relationships either evolve or collapse. If a relationship is built on mutual respect, shared emotional regulation, and honest communication, it often becomes stronger under this shift, because now both individuals are operating from a place of choice rather than fear. There is less manipulation, less emotional bargaining, and more direct expression of needs. The relationship becomes clearer, not necessarily easier, but more honest. And honesty tends to deepen genuine connection. But if a relationship is built on imbalance, where one person's emotional state depends heavily on the other's behavior, then emotional independence introduces instability into that structure. Not because anything has been done aggressively, but because the hidden dependency is no longer silently maintained. The system that once relied on emotional asymmetry begins to lose its foundation. What was once tolerated becomes noticeable. What was once excused becomes evaluated, and this is often misunderstood from the outside. It can appear as if the woman has changed in a disruptive way, when in reality, what has changed is her tolerance for emotional inconsistency. Her nervous system is no longer absorbing volatility as normal. And when that happens, the relationship must either adapt or dissolve. There is also a quieter, but equally important shift happening internally. Emotional independence reduces the intensity of projection. In dependent states, it is common to project unspoken needs onto a partner, expecting them to provide emotional completion, reassurance, or identity stability. But as independence grows, that projection weakens. She begins to see the partner more accurately, not as a source of regulation, but as a separate individual with their own limitations and patterns. This clarity can initially feel uncomfortable because it removes illusion, but it also reduces emotional distortion. There is less overinterpretation of behavior, less assumption filling in gaps, less emotional amplification of small actions. The relationship becomes more grounded in reality rather than interpretation. And with that grounding comes a new kind of power, the ability to stay without attachment, compulsion, and to leave without emotional collapse. Both outcomes become possible, And when both outcomes are possible, choice becomes real. That is the core of emotional independence, not detachment from connection, but freedom within connection. So what emerges is a different kind of relational presence, one that is less reactive, more intentional, less driven by fear, and more guided by internal alignment. And once that shift occurs, it fundamentally changes not just how she participates in relationships, but what she is willing to accept from them. And from that point forward, nothing in her emotional world operates in quite the same way again. When emotional dependency begins to fade, something very interesting happens in the brain and in behavior. The energy that was once continuously allocated to monitoring, maintaining, and managing a relationship becomes available again. That shift is subtle at first, almost imperceptible in daily life, but over time it accumulates into something far more profound. It is not simply that she has more time or more freedom. It is that the internal architecture of attention is being reorganized. In earlier stages of dependency, a significant portion of cognitive and emotional resources is often directed outward, tracking someone else's mood, anticipating responses, adjusting behavior to maintain connection stability. This is mentally expensive. It creates a background load on the nervous system that limits deeper engagement with personal goals, curiosity, and long-term development. So when that load begins to decrease, there is a noticeable shift in mental clarity and energy availability. And this is where personal growth begins to accelerate, not because something new is added, but because something limiting is removed. She starts to notice that goals she once postponed suddenly feel more accessible. Ideas that were previously emotionally overshadowed become clearer. There is a re-emergence of internal direction. This is a critical point. Purpose is not always discovered. Sometimes it is uncovered once emotional noise decreases. One of the first areas that often transforms is career and competence. With less emotional reactivity tied to relational dynamics, focus becomes more stable. She can invest longer periods of attention into work, learning, or skill development without the constant interruption of relational uncertainty. And this sustained attention is where expertise is built. The brain strengthens neural pathways through repetition and focus, not through fragmented engagement. So the ability to sustain focus becomes a direct driver of competence. At the same time, self-efficacy begins to rise. Self-efficacy is essentially the internal belief that one can influence outcomes through their own actions. In dependent emotional states, that belief is often partially outsourced. Success or emotional stability may feel tied to someone else's presence or approval. But as independence grows, that external reference point weakens. She begins to experience direct cause and effect between her actions and her outcomes. I decide, I act, I observe results. That loop is powerful because it reinforces agency. And agency changes behavior in a cascading way. When someone believes their actions matter, they begin to take more deliberate action. Not necessarily more action, but more aligned action. Decisions become less about avoiding discomfort and more about building direction. This is where long-term identity formation begins to stabilize. She is no longer primarily reacting to relational dynamics. She's constructing a trajectory. Alongside this, there is often a deepening investment in mental and physical health, not as a reaction to loss, but as an expression of regained control. Sleep patterns may stabilize. Exercise becomes more consistent. Eating habits become more intentional. These are not superficial changes. They reflect a broader reorganization of self-regulation systems. When emotional volatility decreases, the body often follows. But perhaps one of the most significant transformations happens internally, in how she relates to her own thoughts. There is more tolerance for solitude, more ability to sit without distraction, more willingness to engage in reflection rather than avoidance. This matters because reflection is where identity becomes coherent. Without constant external emotional input, internal narratives begin to settle and organize. She starts to distinguish between inherited beliefs and personally chosen values. And with that distinction, something powerful emerges: authenticity. Not in a performative sense, but in a structural sense. She begins to act in ways that are more consistent with internal values rather than external expectations. This reduces cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension that arises when behavior and belief are misaligned. Lower cognitive dissonance means less internal conflict and less internal conflict means more stable emotional baseline. As this process continues, boundaries with time, energy, and attention become clearer. She becomes more selective about what she engages with, not out of avoidance, but out of recognition that attention is a limited resource. This selectivity is often misunderstood externally as withdrawal, but internally it is experienced as refinement. Less scattered attention, more directed investment. And over time, something quietly fundamental shifts. Her identity is no longer organized around relationship status or external validation, but around capability, direction, and internal consistency. She begins to experience herself as the primary driver of her life trajectory, not a participant in someone else's. That realization does not remove the desire for connection. It changes its structure. Connection is no longer the foundation of identity. It becomes an extension of it, something chosen, not something needed for stability. And that difference reshapes everything about how she moves through the world. Because once a woman experiences her own capacity to build, to grow, and to sustain herself without emotional outsourcing, she does not lose interest in life. She gains authorship over it. When we reach the final layer of this transformation, we arrive at something that is often misunderstood from the outside, because it doesn't present itself as a simple outcome, like happiness or sadness, strength or weakness. It is more nuanced than that. It is the coexistence of expansion and emptiness, of empowerment and quiet solitude, operating at the same time within the same individual. And this duality is what makes emotional independence such a complex psychological state. When a woman no longer needs a man for emotional stability, identity validation, or life direction, she gains a significant degree of internal freedom. That freedom is not abstract. It shows up in real, measurable ways. Decisions are made without hesitation rooted in fear of abandonment. Life choices are not filtered through the question of, will this cost me connection? There is a new sense of psychological space, where actions can be evaluated based on alignment rather than attachment. But what is often not anticipated is that freedom does not only remove constraints, it also removes constant emotional stimulation. And the human nervous system, by design, adapts not just to pain and stress, but also to intensity and attachment patterns. So when those patterns decrease, there can be an initial phase where life feels quieter, less emotionally charged, and in some cases, unexpectedly empty. This is where the hidden truth becomes visible. Independence does not eliminate the human need for connection. It reorganizes it. The desire for closeness, intimacy, and emotional resonance does not disappear. What changes is the urgency and the dependency attached to it. Connection is no longer something required to stabilize identity, but something experienced as an optional, yet meaningful, dimension of life. And this distinction matters more than it might appear at first glance. Because when connection is necessary for emotional survival, it carries pressure. It becomes loaded with expectation. Every interaction has weight. Every silence feels significant. Every inconsistency feels destabilizing. But when connection is no longer a requirement for stability, it becomes lighter. It becomes more observational, more intentional, and paradoxically, more honest. However, in the absence of that dependency structure, another experience can emerge. Moments of emotional distance that are not caused by rejection, but by internal completeness. She may find herself fully engaged in her own life, focused, directed and grounded, and still occasionally sensing a gap where relational intensity used to be. This is not regression. It is recalibration. The nervous system is adjusting to a new baseline where emotional highs and lows are no longer externally driven. And in that recalibration, solitude takes on a new psychological texture. It is no longer automatically associated with loneliness or deficiency. Instead, it becomes a neutral or even restorative state. Yet even in this more stable form, there can still be moments where the absence of shared emotional experience becomes noticeable. Not painful in a dramatic sense, but present, like a quiet echo of a former pattern. This is why emotional independence is not the same as emotional elimination. The brain continues to be wired for attachment. Social connection remains one of the strongest regulatory systems for human behavior. What changes is the internal hierarchy of needs. Stability is no longer outsourced, but internally generated. And once that internal system is strong, external connection becomes optional rather than corrective. But here is the subtle tension. Optional does not mean unnecessary in a human sense. It simply means non-compensatory. She's no longer entering relationships to fix something missing. She's not using connection to resolve instability. Instead, connection becomes something additive, something that enhances an already structured internal life. And this is where relationships change shape again. Because now, the criteria for entering or staying in them are no longer based on emotional dependency, but on resonance, respect, and genuine compatibility. There is less tolerance for emotional confusion, less acceptance of inconsistency, and far more sensitivity to alignment. This can make relationships more selective, but also more real. At the same time, there is a paradox that emerges. The more emotionally independent she becomes, the more conscious she is of the value of authentic connection. Not because she needs it to function, but because she understands its quality more clearly. When something is no longer required for survival, it can finally be appreciated for what it actually is. Yet even with that appreciation, there are moments where the freedom she has built feels expansive but quiet. There is space in her life that is no longer filled by emotional urgency. And in that space, she may encounter a different kind of awareness. That autonomy and connection are not opposites, but parallel needs that must be balanced rather than resolved. This is the core of the hidden truth. A woman who no longer needs a man does not become someone who no longer desires connection. She becomes someone who no longer confuses connection with completion. And that distinction changes everything about how love is experienced, how boundaries are maintained, and how identity is protected. Because in the end, emotional independence is not the absence of need, it is the presence of choice. And once choice becomes the foundation, both freedom and loneliness can exist in the same space without contradiction.